and then we'll jump in. So we do have a smaller number of folks today. So if you have some questions, just put them in the chat box and I will try to work on answering those as we go. If it's something, maybe I'll take a quick look at it. If it's something that might require longer explanation, I might hold that to the end so that we can have a larger conversation. But I'd love to hear from you. Again, I'd love to hear any questions that you have or experiences that you'd like to share. It always makes the class, I think, a lot more enjoyable. So I am recovering from a cold, so I apologize if my voice is a little bit groggy. I've got tea, I've got drinks, I've got lozenges. So if I have to pause and cough, I may have to do that, but hopefully that won't happen. But just thank you for your patience on that. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Amber. I am the Family Consumer Sciences Extension Agent for Larimer County and Colorado State University. So that means that my background is nutrition and food science, and specifically food preservation. And so this is the last class of a series of classes that we do yearly, starting in the spring, with all the different methods for food preservation, and really a part of within the growing season each year. And this is always my favorite one because it's just, I think, so unique and versatile, and so many people are interested in it. So with that, we'll just jump in. So what's so interesting about sauerkraut is that a lot of folks think that sauerkraut comes from the German heritage, right? But what's interesting is that sauerkraut, fermenting vegetables, has actually taken place long before this period of time, right? I'm going to be letting a few more folks in here. So what's interesting is we have documentation that Chinese laborers building the Great Wall of China over 2,000 years ago were eating fermented cabbage as standard fare. Now, if you have interest in fermentation in other cultures, you know that there are ferments all around the world that are staples for different cultures. And so one of the next one that you might already be familiar with is kimchi. And that's something that's made from not only cabbage, but made from ginger, garlic, red pepper, rice wine, all different kinds of varieties of ingredients, and then fermented underground in beautiful, huge kinds of crocks. And that's a fun one to do as well. So what is the science behind fermentation? And really, it's pretty simple, actually. So wild fermentation happens through the fermenting process because there's already bacteria normally present on the vegetables, the kind of vegetables that we can ferment. And then you add salt to it, okay? Fermentation requires anaerobic conditions. And then what happens is when you mix that vegetable, you allow that bacteria to do its work, you are getting the production of lactic acid. And what that lactic acid does is it decreases the pH of the product. It acts as a preservative. And so pathogenic organisms can't grow, right? So much of what we do in food preservation, think like canning, water pressure or water bath canning or pressure canning, is reducing any kind of bacterial overgrowth, right? And we're doing that through heat, we're doing that through pressure, but fermentation is a little bit different than that. We do have anaerobic conditions. We have air going into it, and it's through that lactic acid and through time that we can limit the bacterial growth of the bad bacterial and increase the bacterial growth of the good bacteria, that lactic acid. So a little bit of a science background here as well, okay? So the salting of the vegetables, it serves two major purposes. It's drawing water and nutrients from the vegetable, and then that juice contains fermentable carbohydrates or sugars, and it's an excellent growth medium for bacteria involved in fermentation. And that, again, inhibits the growth of many spoilage organisms and pathogens. And it's osmosis that draws out that fluid and acts as a preservative.
Hi, Amber. This is Pam. I'm finally on.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
great. No problem. And I just did want to introduce Pam to you all. Pam is a Master Food Safety Advisor for CSU Extension in Larimer County. So Master Food Safety Advisors go through almost a week-long training developed by campus, all about food preservation, all about food science. And then she's able to work in the community to help educate community about all the different kinds of things related to food preservation. So Pam is at the farmers market. She's helping with classes. She is just fantastic. So if you're interested in that program, let me know. And Pam, if there's anything that you would like to interject throughout this presentation, we would love to hear from you. So thank you for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
So take a look at this. So this diagram shows the evolution of the different lactic acid producing bacteria over time through that fermentation process. So you can see here at the very beginning of the fermentation process, you see one type of bacteria here. So I'm probably going to butcher this name, but Leuconostoc Menestroides. I'm not a scientist first, so I apologize if there's any scientists out there. So you can see there's a very high number of these at the beginning of the process. And as time goes on, it doesn't take very long for those to drop off. And then you can see the Lactobacillus plantarum, that starts to pick up and do its work. And then that drops off. And then the Lactobacillus brevis through time picks up and then drops off, okay? So the diversity of these organisms make them very adaptable to a range of conditions, and it's largely responsible for the success of vegetable ferments. They need the right temperature, they need the right pH to do their work, and as they're doing their work and dropping off, the fermentation is developing and making your food so delicious. I need a Bill Nye the Science Guy expert to make this even more exciting for you. But so the next step we're going to talk about is just the preparation and fermenting process. What does that look like? So you can see here, there are a number of different types of fermenting crocks or containers available to you. And so we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail, okay? And really the whole process. So the basic ingredients of sauerkraut, which we'll start with, we'll talk about some other vegetables, is really cabbage. That's the main ingredient. So what's recommended is to use fully mature, large heads with a white interior. So those are the best ones. The larger the head, the sweeter it is. And you can get different kinds of cabbage varieties available locally currently through different farm stands and farms that we have available. It's height of growth right now and height of harvesting time for those. And the amount of natural sugars in a cabbage is going to be a little bit different based on variety, the growing conditions, the temperature available, all those kinds of things. So what I've used in past classes is a cabbage that actually looks like about this big. It looks like a cone, a little cone shape. And those were just fantastic. And the farm had recommended that one specifically for sauerkraut. So you can even check with your farmer to see what they would recommend. Okay. Now, salt being the only really other ingredient that you need for this fermentation process does have a little bit of nuance to it, okay? So it's important that you use pickling or canning salt if you have that available to you, and then to use the amount is specified in a research-tested recipe. So you don't want to use iodized salt, okay? Why not? Iodine prevents bacterial fermentation, which is necessary to produce sauerkraut. It's going to inhibit that process, okay? Now, if you use too little salt, that will soften the cabbage tissue and yield a product that really lacks flavor. But if you use too much salt, that will delay the natural fermentation, and oversalting may even cause unpleasant flavor, a dark color. It can allow yeast to grow that may show up as like a pink color. So there definitely are some things that can happen if you don't have those right ratios, okay? So what we recommend is I have a little chart here for you that shows you different sizes of ferments. So one of the things you can do is use a quart jar, and I have this here, and I'm going to pull this up multiple times so that you can see what this looks like. So this is a standard quart jar. So if you want to start small, which I absolutely recommend that you do, so you don't get into, too much time, too much expense, start with a quart. And what you'll need is 1 3/4 pounds of shredded cabbage to fill this jar. You'll need only a tablespoon of salt. If you want to do a 1/2 gallon jar, you would need 3.5 pounds and 2 tablespoons of salt. You can also do 5-gallon container sauerkraut, and that'll take you 25 pounds and then 12 tablespoons. Okay. So those are the ratios that we have available to you today. So in the chat at the end of the presentation, I will drop in a link to our Food Smart Colorado website from CSU Extension that will give you the recipe for all 3 of these amounts. And then also a little handout that gives you just the quart jar, because that's the one that I actually use in class. And so we have a specific one for class if we were together. Okay, now there's varieties of containers that you can use. So you can use a ceramic crock if you have that available to you, the glass jars like I showed you before, and food grade plastic buckets. So these are really easy to get at like a restaurant supply store, for example. We have a couple in Fort Collins that I know they're available, and they're pretty inexpensive to use. So think about the amount that you'd like to use. I have a friend that I went to school with who had one of these really lovely crocks on the right that you see here, the brown. And what's interesting about it is on the top of that crock, there's actually about a 3-inch lip that the lid goes down into. So it's like a reservoir that allows for some of the fermentation and some of that water to bubble up over it without it completely overflowing and getting everywhere on your surface that it's sitting on. And so some of those crocks that are available are just, so much fun to use. Now, it's absolutely essential that you cover the cabbage and liquid to limit the air exposure, since fermentation requires anaerobic conditions. So that's without air. So there is going to be a little bit in there, but it's important that you weigh that down so that everything is tight, it's packed, it's happy. So you have different options for that too. You can use different kinds of fermentation discs, which you see here. This is just an unglazed ceramic dish. You can use a dinner plate or a glass pie plate or something smaller that's slightly smaller than the container opening. And then you weigh that down with some bags of 2 or 3 sealed quart bags filled with water, or we actually recommend brine filled bag in case that bag breaks open for any reason. What's going to come out is brine, and it's not going to ruin the salt levels and the pH levels of the ferment as as the water level goes up for any reason. So it's really just kind of a safety mechanism. And then you place plastic wrap fitted snug against the sides of the container under the weight to keep air off the surface. So that's if you're doing a very large ferment. Okay. I'm going to walk you through the steps a little bit more and the details of that as we go with the equipment that I have here today. Now, the covers to prevent any kind of contamination from insects coming in or mold growing are important as well. So you can use a ceramic crock cover like you see here, a plastic bucket lid, a jar lid, a clean towel is typically what I will use. So you have a number of options, okay? More about equipment. To shred the cabbage, you can use a large sharp knife. You can use a food processor, which is what I often do, just a couple of cups at a time, a mandolin, or even a kraut cutter if you can get your hands on one. I love this. It's a nice big square center that you cut your cabbage into, and then you slide that whole thing across and your hands and your fingers are safe. The food processor is really nice because it just makes it all come together a lot faster. If you're with friends, maybe using a large sharp knife is a better option for you. So when you're preparing your cabbage for fermentation, an important thing to do is to discard those outer leaves. Because we're wanting to encourage the bacterial growth of the cabbage, just taking off those outer leaves is a really great method for getting rid of anything that is undesirable that we don't want in the ferment, okay? And then you're going to rinse your cabbage under cold water, then you're going to drain it, and then you'll cut your cabbages into quarters and then core those cabbages. So you don't want to keep those cores in the fermentate or in the ferment, okay? And then you're going to shred the cabbage, place it in a mixing bowl or fermentation container. The one thing I want to say about this is that we don't recommend using metal bowls for this. You don't want any kind of interaction with those metals. So make sure you're using plastic food grade buckets or large glass bowls, or like a ceramic bowl. If you have a big ceramic serving dish, that might be a good option for you. So once you've got that, the cabbage shredded, you've got it in the bowl, the next thing you're going to want to do is add salt and then mix that thoroughly to get that distributed really evenly all over the cabbage. And then you're going to let it wait for about 5 or 10 minutes to let the water start drying out of the cabbage. Now for large batches, we recommend working with about 5 pounds of cabbage, add the salt, and then repeat. So you're going to have 12 tablespoons of salt in that large bucket. You can see here in this photo, I think this was a get-together of Master Food Safety Advisors working on this all in a group. So it'll take a little bit more time to get all of that salt distributed throughout. And then what's next? You need to use your fists or your hands or a wooden tamper or a masher to start massaging that cabbage firmly enough that the juices start to come out. And when you press it down in that container, that there's enough juice that comes up, that bubbles up to cover that cabbage by about 1 inch or 2 of water, okay? And then you can see here that the container should be deep enough so that the rim is 4 to 5 inches above the cabbage. So you don't want that cabbage so closely at the rim of your container that there's no room for bubbling over, right? So you need some kind of allowance for more liquid to come up, okay? Now, if you're doing this in a smaller container, such as a quart jar, you obviously don't need 4 or 5 inches. It's a lot smaller for that, okay? So if the juice doesn't cover your cabbage by 1 to 2 inches, you can make more brine and then add that boiled and then cooled to your container. So if you are making a small batch, you can do that ahead of time. If you're making large batches, you can do that ahead of time. And the ratio that we suggest for the brine is 1.5 tablespoons of canning salt per quart of water, okay? Now, I am going to stop here just for a moment because we were talking about what that 1 to 2 inches looks like, what the weight looks like in the larger containers, and I'll show you what that looks like here. But I want to kind of demonstrate it to you what that should look like in the smaller ones. So you can see here, we talked about creating the brine, adding it into a Ziploc bag, weighing that large container, that 5-gallon container of sauerkraut down with like a plate, and then you put your brine over the top of that plate, or you put a bag filled with brine. So that acts as a weight to keep the cabbage down, to keep it underwater, okay? And that really is just the purpose of that bag of brine. Now, if you are doing just one batch, you've got your bowl, you set aside, you're mixing it, you're making sure it's really well massaged, really nice and even. What I like to do is I like to pick up like a big handful and squeeze it. And if water just drips out of the cabbage, then I basically know it's ready. And then I can take that cabbage and then I can start packing it into this jar to fill it. And I say, you can stick your hand in there, you can push it down nice and evenly all around in an even layer. You can watch it go down. You don't want it too loose. You don't want it too tight. It's a little bit of, I would say, practice of getting used to it. And then you fill, I would say fill it to about this level here, right at the shoulder of this jar. Okay. And then you push it down a little bit more and you'll see that water level go up. And so you want at least an inch of water in a quart jar like this. Okay. So how do you keep the weight? How do you create a weight situation like you see here for the large batches? So what you can do is you can actually use a small jelly jar because it actually fits perfectly inside of this jar here. Okay. So this can act as your weight to hold everything down. And then what I like to do is once this is sitting, I'll push this down here a little bit more on my countertop. Once this is sitting in here, then how do you keep your things covered, right? Because we talked about different covers. What I like to do is I like to use a ring. And what I do is I will, I'll show you what I do. Here's a tissue handy. This is always handy for me. This can be a cheesecloth, or it could be a tissue, or it could be like a paper towel. I put that over the top of my weight, and that weight is there. And then in order to create a cover, I just put my ring over the top of it, just like this, okay? And so it's safely covered from any flies or anything getting in, okay? It also will allow some of the liquid to come out if it needs to bubble over. So you never want to put this on the countertop just by itself. Put it in some kind of a shallow dish or something, because you will get some of the material bubbled over. If you don't have one of these little tiny jars that fits really nicely inside of here, you can use a slightly larger one. It's just going to stick out probably a little bit. Same thing. You take your cloth, your cheesecloth, your paper towel, you stick it over the top of it so that it covers, and then you stick this ring over the top of that, screw it down, and then while you're fermenting, it just looks a little bit like this, okay? And it's just the same. It's just as effective, okay? So those are some options for you. All right. Let me get here to the next slide. So you'll want, once everything is packed, everything is covered, you'll want to place your container in a well-ventilated place with fairly constant temperature. So think about where that might be in your house, okay? I've lived in different homes where it works just in different spaces. So whatever works for you. And what's interesting is there is a temperature range that you should consider in where you put it. So you don't want it below 55 degrees because the product may not ferment. And again, this is for the really large crocks, but it can also apply to the small ones. 55 to 60 degrees is really great. That lower temperature is going to cause your ferment to take a little bit longer because it's a little bit cold. Really, the optimal thing that you can do probably for smaller batches is between 70 and 75 degrees. It's only going to take 3 to 4 weeks. Now consider that timing and what processes happen during fermentation. Your product actually might taste a little bit different if you're doing a longer, cooler ferment versus a shorter, warmer ferment. And you just don't want anything above 80 degrees because it may soften or spoil. It's just not optimal for those bacteria to be in that kind of condition. Okay, so you've got everything ready. Excuse me. You are ready to set your container out and start the process. What does that look like? So really, you just let it sit. And you're going to check the container 2 or 3 times a week and skim off any yeast or mold that forms on the surface, okay? It's normal for that to happen, so you just scrape it off and you'll be fine. The formation of gas bubbles is indicating that fermentation is taking place. So you can look at your container and you'll see some of those bubbles starting to rise up, okay? So you know that it's working. And if you're using for a large ferment, a brine-filled bag, it's unlikely that yeast or mold will form. versus something like this. So don't disturb it until normal fermentation is complete. But these little guys, you may need to scrape off some of the bacteria or the mold or yeast that will come up, and you'll see it. It'll look off in color. You'll know that that's not right. Okay. So Sarah is saying, if it's the smaller jar inside a quart jar, was that still using only the ring part of the screw on lid? Yes. So you don't actually have to fill this. This jar can be empty because it acts like a weight itself. Okay, so I just put it in empty. And then the lid, the screw on lid, fits over the top of it because this is a wide mouth lid and this is wide mouth versus this being like a narrow mouth. So it's just fitting right over the top. And what you're doing is you are, by using this here, you're securing your cover. Okay. If that answers your question, or if it doesn't, let me know and we can talk about it a little bit more. Okay. Now, if you're doing different kinds of, Melly's asking if we have a picture of yeast and mold in that form. I don't readily have that. I'm thinking from my own experience. Like when you put the sauerkraut or when you put the shredded cabbage in the jar and ready to go to ferment, it should taste delicious as it is. It should be pleasantly salty. There will be some bubbles because of all this, the squeezing that you've done, but the bubbles will be largely colorless, or maybe a little bit of the color of the cabbage juice. And you'll know if yeast or mold grows on top of that, it will not be the same color. It will be different from what you put in the jar. So really that's how you know, is that it's a different color. Okay.
Yeah, I usually, when I have the yeast or mold, it's usually white fuzzy.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious that it's not something that belongs there.
Perfect. Thank you, Pam.
Mm-hmm.
And Melly, if you have a question, like you could take a picture and email that to me and I can look at it. If you get to that stage and you're not sure, I'm happy to do that for you.
Yeah. So I have a question.
Yeah.
So I mean, you mean it's okay just to take out the yeast and the mold, or we have to take out some of the food too? Because like, I mean, I just like, let's say it took like 3 to 4 weeks to ferment, and then let's say in the middle, and then I found something, oh, I don't think this is just the bubble, so it's yeast and mold. Should I take out some of the cabbage too, or
no? Yeah, that's a really great question.
Take it out, everything.
Yeah, it's a great question. So because you have that barrier of water, that yeast in the mold is going to be exactly what Pam says. The mold usually floats on top of the brine. So you just need to take a little spoon and just scrape it off. And you should still have that protective layer of that brine that's separating the yeast and the mold from the actual ferment itself. Okay. Now, if you get to a point where I've actually had this happen, when it was too warm, it's going to evaporate some of your brine. And so if for any reason you have mold or yeast on top of your cabbage and you have lost your brine level, then you could scrape off some of that mold if it's on the surface. But what you see at that point is that you need to make more brine and add it, because otherwise your ferment is just completely drying out. Okay.
How about with your jar method, that you put the smaller bottle as a weight? Do I have to make sure it's the same 1 to 2 inches brine also need to be there, or how is it?
Yeah, I would suggest about at least 1 inch of brine.
Oh,
so right here from the shoulder, the widest part of the shoulder, to the bottom of this lip right here.
Okay. And then with your experience, which method actually, is it just the temperature who can make the yeast and mold, or is it some method better than the other?
You're asking if like which temperature is better to
No, I
ferment?
mean, is it just the temperature who caused the yeast and mold, or with your experience with trying so many different methods? I mean, with that small bowl, with the smaller bottle as a
Mhm.
weight, or with the bag of the brine as a weight. So which one do you think have less tendency to have mold and yeast?
Using the brine filled bag actually has less tendency. So I have not
Oh,
really
okay.
seen, I only really get mold, or it doesn't happen very often. And it was really early in my, it's like the more you practice it, you're probably not going to see it. You'll get better at it. But in the beginning, I was seeing it in the smaller containers, which typically ended up in warmer environments. So if you can have the larger container with the brine filled bag, you probably are not going to have that mold growth.
Okay.
Pam, do you have any other input on that?
No, that's been my experience too. I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great questions, Melly. Thank you.
Thank you.
So for a container like this can take only 5 to 7 days. So it depends on, again, that temperature that you have. But another thing that you can look at is, has the bubbling stopped? When you take it off, smell it. It should smell pleasantly sour. It should smell really great. Now, there is, I'm going to say, a stinky teenager phase. So probably about 3 days into fermentation, you might walk into your kitchen, if it's on top of your refrigerator or anywhere, and you'll say, what does that smell? It just kind of stinks a little bit for a couple of days. It's totally fine. It mellows out, and then you won't smell that anymore. Taste it. It should taste delicious. As it ferments, it's going to be a little bit more tangy. So if you let it go a little bit longer, that increased acidity is going to affect that flavor. And then you decide how you like it. You might like it a little bit less tangy. You might like it a little bit more. So that's why I really like experimenting in small batches, so that you get a sense for how it works in your house, in your environment, and the flavors that you prefer. And then you can experiment with different kinds of flavors in small batches. So once it's done, now what? So you do want to keep protecting it, because it is still, somewhat subject to molds. And so in order to do that, you can't just let this out on your countertop. You want to put it in refrigeration. So for short-term storage, you just store it in this jar. You don't want to use like the lid and the band for regular canning, because it will probably come in contact with that metal. And I even have a little bit of a rusty lid here, or a little band. And I do notice that if I have used it in the past, just that typical canning lid, that it can cause rust on that lid. So what I like to do is use a plastic lid to store it in. And then how do you enjoy it? You just take it out, you scoop a little bit off, and you enjoy it as you would any other condiment you have in your kitchen or in your refrigerator. You can also store it, if you have those large containers, in a cool place, but it requires a lot more protection. So you want to make sure that it's really well covered, and that it has that lid tightly on it, and that it's in a good temperature range for storage. Okay. So in a basement or garage or other storage area where it's around 55 degrees or less, keep it covered, keep it weighted down. You're going to have to take all of those pieces off of it, the plate, the plastic, the Ziploc bag, scoop out what you want, and then make sure that everything is covered really nicely again. And this is how they did it before we had refrigeration, right? And so just, check that surface, scrape off anything that's grown on top, get rid of that, and then get down to that better layer of that ferment, and you can keep going. So I did just mention this, but the timing of this is you can keep this into 6 months or so in your refrigerator. It's fantastic. It will actually change flavor and mellow out a little bit the longer you keep it in your refrigerator. And I've kept it for longer than 6 months. I think I've got 8 or 10 months and it's still delicious. So it's kind of, I did that as an experiment to see what would change. And it was still fantastic and delicious. So you can also freeze it. So you can put it in like freezer bags or rigid plastic containers. You just want to make sure that you're going to put at least 1.5 inches of headspace in there, so you have some room for that liquid to expand. Okay. Some people enjoy frozen sauerkraut more than canning, so I'm going to talk about that next. But the freezing process doesn't kill any significant amount of the cultures that we really like, those really wonderful probiotics that are so good for us. So what's interesting about the freezing state is those cultures actually go into a dormant state. But when they're returned to a room temperature and eaten within the body, they become active again and are capable of providing all the benefits of those probiotics and those cultures that are so good for us. However, you can water bath can it for longer term storage. You can hot pack it. And so what you would do with that is you'd bring the kraut to a slow boil in a large pot, remove it from the heat, and then fill those jars and the juices, leaving 1/2 inch of headspace. And I wouldn't recommend, I'm not sure, Pam, have you canned sauerkraut before in large jars?
No, I have not, because I really enjoy having the probiotics, and canning kills them. So
Yeah. So I have actually went to school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for grad school. And this was where I learned about sauerkraut and fermentation. And a lot of people do that in that region because there's a lot of, Pennsylvania Dutch, German heritage in Pennsylvania. And I was gifted a jar of canned sauerkraut by someone who was still making it with their parents who are in their 90s. And she just pulled it off a jar from her garage. And it was one of the best batches of sauerkraut I've ever had. And it was canned. I think it was the freshness of the cabbage that they used and their experience over time. But even though it was canned, it was still so delicious. Okay. You can also cold pack your jars. You don't have to heat them. The thing about cold pack is that you might not be able to put as much of the product in the jar. It'll just have a little bit less in it. And there's more details we can get into if you want to know more about that. So just like Pam mentioned, there is a little bit of a difference when you're canning sauerkraut. You are going to be destroying that probiotic bacteria. So maybe you just have a large garden and you have so much cabbage that you really don't have the choice to do it fresh. It's just a good option for you, just so you're aware. But some of the things that you can see here, you will be changing vitamin C, biotin, niacin, folic acid, B6, but minerals and fiber are not going to be affected by that. And what's so interesting is you can see here, this is actually a scientific study that shows what those differences are, if you're interested in taking a look at that. Okay, so this is where the fun part is. I love just straight up cabbage and salt sauerkraut, but I have learned to do some experimenting, and I would love to introduce this to you as well. So there's a number of things that you can do to your kraut to make it your own, special signature kraut. And that can be adding any kind of variety of these additions to it. I would just say, just add a little bit at a time. And then as you are kind of aware of the changes that happen and the flavors that you're looking for, then you can start adding more in. But really the base of your ferment is going to be cabbage if you're trying to make a sauerkraut. Now, there are other things that you can ferment all on their own. It's just a little bit trickier, and you can find those resources as you get more into it. One of my favorite ferments that I love to make is a sauerkraut with green cabbage, shredded beets, and ginger. And the color of that is as vibrant as the color of the beets. And it is such a wonderful combination. So you shred the cabbage, you shred the beets, you shred the ginger, and you put it all there together, and it's just fantastic. And then also I wanted to mention there's another variety of a ferment. You see here turnips. So if you ferment only turnips and not cabbage, that's actually called sour Reuben. And you follow the exact same process, but with turnips instead of cabbage. And it's a sweeter, I just can't even describe it. Just so fantastic, so delicious. Turnips are in season right now. If you want to just do a small jar, you could probably get a bundle or two of them, like a little bundle from farmers, local farmers, and then do a jar like that. I would highly recommend it. So have fun, do some experimenting. There's so many different kinds of ferments available to you. But, if we go back to, basic sauerkraut, what can you do with it? So it's fantastic to marinate and braise meats in. You can stuff it in pierogies and dumplings, add it to soup, eat it with sausages, put it in your grilled cheese sandwich. You can make a Reuben sandwich out of it. That's probably the most classic one people know about. But you can also make a German chocolate cake with sauerkraut in it. And there's a recipe from Michigan State University. I'm going to give you the link. That is a recipe for that sauerkraut cake, which I highly recommend. Other ferments, you can do kimchi pancakes even. So that's just kind of a thing to get you started. But Pam says the cake is delicious. Have you made that, Pam?
No, but I sampled what somebody else did, and it's to die for. It's great.
Same. Yes, same. Maybe this winter, that'll be a good project for me to do, is to make that cake on my own so I can say that I've done it. I actually love to have sauerkraut with, when I will make a piece of toast, like a whole grain piece of toast, fry an egg on top, and then put some sauerkraut on top of that. It is so good. So anything that you can think of, like savory, it's a really great combination for. And I put in the chat box, if anybody else has ways they love to eat sauerkraut, I would love to hear from you, because I'm always interested in new ideas. Back to that jar of really delicious kraut that I got from a friend in Pennsylvania. I just sat over the kitchen sink and just ate it with a spoon out of the jar. But again, back to the freshness of that cabbage, getting it as soon from harvest as possible into the jar, you will notice a quality difference. But because we are in the season of cabbage, anything that you get currently is probably going to be very nice and fresh for you. Okay. So we are just at the last couple of slides here in the last few minutes of our presentation. So wanted to remind you, just having some tips for success for your fermentation projects. Make sure everything is clean. So your kitchen, your equipment, your utensils, your crocks, your hands are clean, is so important, because we don't want to introduce any kind of spoilage organisms into your ferment. And then make sure everything is well rinsed. So everything is washed and everything is rinsed well. You don't want any kind of soap residue to interfere with that fermentation. Okay. And then again, I mentioned before, I have experienced lower brine levels where it kind of gets a little bit dry. I have chalked it up to it being too warm, but this is a great reminder that it can also, you can lose brine if your cabbage is a little bit older. That could have also been the case as well, because it started out a little bit drier. So that freshness is so important. And then the fact sheets that I was telling you about. So University of Wisconsin has a really wonderful, very long fact sheet full of really great information and recipes all about sauerkraut. And that's a really great one to start at. And then I'm going to go back to the chat box, because our Food Smart Colorado has that recipe that I was telling you about that has the different quantities of salt and cabbage based on, or the different recipes based on the different quantities that you want to make. So you can see, if you will take a look at the chat box. Oh, sorry about that. I actually put in, I was a little bit ahead of myself, a survey, an online survey that should take you about 3 minutes. I just dropped that in the chat box. If everyone's interested or willing to fill out that survey for me, I would be greatly appreciative of that. And then I also just dropped in Food Smart Colorado's Understanding and Making Sauerkraut Fact Sheet. And that will give you all the information that I gave you today, just in a different format. So take a look at that link and let me know if you have any questions. So that is the end of our presentation. And I enjoyed speaking with you today. It was really great sharing this information. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat box or unmute, and I would love to chat with you for a few more minutes. Other than that, you are welcome to go, and I will stop my recording real quick here. And thank you again, everyone, for joining today. Happy fermenting. I'd love to hear from you. If you have questions or if you've had successes, I'd love to hear more about that.